The things I've seen in the dark corners of Runeterra are better left unseen.
The conflicts of the Rune Wars would rage on for decades, and the civilization of humankind would be consumed by the raging powers of the arcane. It not only affected the continent of Valoran, but it has engulfed the entirety of Runeterra. Only those who were in far distant lands, and those who took refuge inside of the mortal bastion, would be the fortunate ones to be alive, and would soon see the end of it. As the war raged on, the mage, Tyrus, who attempted to settle the conflict in the old village of Calm before its destruction, his apprentice, Rise, who was born in Calm, would confront his master in his attempt to assist one side of the war. But Tyrus refused, and wishes to guide civilization back to peace, and prevent any further conflicts. Rise would respect this choice. Tyrus persuaded the apprentice to try and attempt to sway humanity to seize its destruction. Within the years of endless conflicts, however, there were no signs of stopping. Rise then had no other choice but to confront his master in his desire to bring a decisive end to the wars. Then, what he saw was Tyrus in possession of not one, but two world runes in his grasp. Tyrus argued that there was no other way to stop the war, and said to his apprentice that the two runes in his hands are the only way to stop the people, that common mortals were just reckless children, toying with powers they did not understand. He would no longer play a diplomat to ignorant warmongers. It was then, at this very moment, after failing to reason with him, Rise no longer saw his mentor. What he saw was just another man who had fallen into temptation from the powers of the world runes. In their argument, Rise had no other choice but to kill his own master. Mustering all of the magical powers that he could, the great mage Tyrus has fallen. His great mentor has failed his mission. If these deadly artifacts could corrupt a mage with the strength and integrity of Tyrus, how was Rise to handle them? At the same time, however, he knew he could not entrust them to any other living soul, leaving him alone in the task to search for the last remaining runes. For as long as any world rune remained unsecured, Runeterra was doomed. The Rune Wars would only come to its end after all of civilization of mortals in Valoran were completely annihilated and destroyed. The very few number of survivors fled further west, some further to the south, and some away from the Valorian continent. But in this story, the survivors, hidden away in the immortal bastion, would finally re-emerge. In their sight, when they finally opened the great gates, when all of the great civilizations in the continent all but destroyed each other, they saw nothing but ruins and the landscape all but a barren wasteland. What mattered to them, however, was that they survived, and they would ally as a single people. No longer Noxai, but Noxians, under a single unified banner, Noxus. It was on this very day that they re-emerged. This has marked their calendar from this date ever since, with now its prior events in its history being referred to as the years before the founding of Noxus. For the next 300 years after the founding of Noxus, the noble houses declared and vowed to unify all the nations of Runeterra beneath a single banner. The single banner of the Empire of Noxus. As it assets its own circumstances, the barren wastelands would not yield any resources for crops and sustenance. The noble houses then came to an agreement that they could not just stay idle. They must gather resources no matter the conditions. The Empire, now led by its strong-handed leader, the Grand General, as decided by the noble houses, began to lead the war host towards its purpose, to forcefully annex numerous territories for its survival, for Noxus, for strength is above all. The Empire's first target was to expand and consolidate its powers further to the east. It was then, around 292 to 349 years after the founding of Noxus, the war host would secure a coastal settlement in the east, known as the Drakengate. This campaign would be one of the many major victories for the ever-expanding empire. Over the next centuries of their conquests, many Noxians obtained riches, and some accumulated power that spat in the face of the Noxian principles, where strength is above all for many. For these handful of the Noxian aristocracy, money was above strength. Unbeknownst to most in Noxus, the Black Rose, which, despite its silence, were not idle, had corrupted the Empire's heart, taking control over parts of the nation's nobility, its military, and even the Grand General who sat on its throne. Both of its co-leaders, Vladimir and LeBlanc, the latter seemingly reappearing, continued to manipulate the Empire of Noxus from the shadows, recruiting many of the aristocracy into their fold. And they were responsible for many of the number of its most significant imperial campaigns across the continent. It was later in the last few centuries, around 790 to 892 years after the founding of Noxus, most of central Valorant had now been annexed by the Empire's war hosts, and is now occupied under the single banner of Noxus. The east and southern coasts were now fully under its control, and many of those who were deemed weak to rule over their own smaller lordships were removed, and in place, the people were assimilated into the Empire. But the warring culture of the Noxians would drive these people into larger ambitions. Its old vow to unite the people of Runeterra under the one banner was absolute. Its people striving for war now embedded in their cultural psyche that developed a saying, "Kill them until they are family." The Empire's next conquest would now move towards the west, with its goal of conquering the western coasts of the Valorant continent. By the year 892 after the founding, the Noxians, who were essentially uncontested, would finally meet their match. In the aftermath of the Rune Wars, there were those who fled further to the west and did not align themselves with the Noxians and just wished to escape the destruction of arcane magic. These people would take refuge within a forest of tall white trees, which seemingly absorbed magic, meaning that they were safe from the Rune War's effects. This kingdom that has now matched the Noxians in their strength would be known as the Kingdom of Demacia. For the next 3 years, the two most powerful factions on the continent of Valoran would wage war against each other. Eventually, the Kingdom of Demacia, led by their proud King Jarvan I, would overpower the Noxians, outmatching them, and would drive them back eastwards towards Havardis, a fortified settlement southeast of the Gates of Morning. It seems that the Noxians have lost. However, in the distant lands of the Argent Mountains, a Noxian warlord, a towering marauder, who was one of the strongest and most powerful, known by the name of Scion, led his own war band to march towards Havardis to regain the lost territory from the Demacians. As Scion's army arrived, the Demacian army was within their horizon. However, they had no intention of pursuing the Noxians any further, seeing that they had driven the invading army from the lands neighboring their own. They were preparing to return home. To this, the Noxian commander at Havardis had decided to let the Demacians leave without enticing any further assault, seeing that there may be no need for any more bloodshed. But as seen in Noxian culture, strength is above all. Outraged at this display, Scion hurled the commander from the city walls and ordered the attack. The Noxian army then began to charge forward.
Noxus! Charge!
As the Noxians charge into the Demacian lines, the great warlord Scion would see himself engulfed and surrounded as the rest of the Noxian soldiers would be outnumbered in men and fiercely slain. Alone, Scion would cleave through countless men with his battle axe. His armor would rent through the countless blows and strikes from the Demacians, which would be more than enough to kill any common soldier. But Scion kept fighting through. It was then, standing deep behind enemy lines, Scion came face to face with King Jarvan I. The two leaders of their commanding armies drew themselves into a duel. Strike after strike, the proud King Jarvan I would unfortunately be no match for the much stronger and more warlike Scion. The towering marauder would reach and grasp the Demacian king by his throat, till Jarvan I drew his last breath. Only then, after sustaining countless wounds and blows, and only after slaying the king, the marauder, grand warlord of the Noxians, Scion would finally allow himself to die. With their king dead, the Demacians would retreat back beyond their borders. The Noxians would then retrieve the body of their fallen warlord and would commence the Empire's period of mourning. Scion, now seen as a fallen hero to the Noxians, would have his body entombed within a towering monument constructed in his own likeness in honor of him for all time in the Empire. Returning out onto the battlefields, for over the next half-century, the years 895 to 942 after the founding of Noxus, the Demacians would end up freeing the countries of central Valoran from Noxian dominance, pushing the Noxians back towards their capital in the Immortal Bastion. In time, the Grand General position of Noxus would come under new leadership, with its new figure now sitting on its throne, Grand General Borum Darkwill. within the first 3 years of his reign, Darkwill would make it his goal to reclaim the former glory of the Empire, seeing it reclaim its old conquered lands, and to go further beyond. Darkwill will pay any price for such to see all of this through. It was then the Grand General approached the secret cabal, which still continued to operate in shadow, the Black Rose. Darkwill, his closest allies within the noble aristocracy, along with the Black Rose, reopened Sion's tomb, the first time it was unsealed since its construction. Using the forbidden magics as blood and dark magic weave through the air, the Black Rose reanimated the long-dead hero and presented him to the Grand General. The warlord Sion stood once again. The Grand General then ordered the reanimated warlord to be unleashed back onto the battlefield to continue the Empire's fight against the Demacians. It was just in a few battles the Noxian warhost would bring more victories for the Empire. However, the bloodlusts of Sion started to become problematic. In between battles, where the slaughtering of enemies aren't present, the blood magic that sustained his corpse body began to consume his mind, leaving him to crave and thirst for blood. The longer this was left unattended, Sion would wreak havoc within the Noxian warhosts. No matter if friend or foe, Sion would go on a killing spree, trying to satiate his bloodlust. Sion's bloodlust was deemed uncontrollable, and Borum Darkwill ordered for his imprisonment. Hundreds of warriors died trying to restrain him before he was finally bound in chains and dragged back to the immortal bastion. Without slaughter, the blood magic that sustained him quickly engulfed his mind in an all-consuming rage. His roars would finally fell silent once he was finally sealed back beneath his giant statue. In turn, the warring conquest for Noxus would be delayed in terms of battling against Demacia. The Empire instead positioned itself to focus on defending its existing territorial borders, and would shift its focus in expanding the borders towards the far east and towards the south. In the year 972 after the founding of Noxus, 2 Noxian naval vessels would intercept a fishing vessel named the Viscero. The ship was from a far distant land that was separated by the sea, far from the Valoran continent, but was still in reach. The land known as Ionia. Alongside the confiscation of the fish, the crew would then be captured by the Noxians. One could say these men would be used for hard labor. Others would also say they would be used as fodder troops for the Noxian warhosts. However, for many, particularly for one member of the Viscero crew, a young man named Xin Zhao, would be forced into the brutal life to become a reckoner. These captured men would serve as live entertainment for the Noxians, live viewers from trials of combat, duels against humans, and other forms of creatures. For Xin Zhao, in particular, his captors recognize his natural talent with a spear. Subsequently, Xin's new life as a reckoner has begun. Much like others such as him, reckoners shall serve as entertainment for the Noxian nobility. In addition, the Noxian border towards the south of Valoran was further expanded, which now stretches the Empire's reach to the Great Barrier. The southern regions of Valoran were not only home to the eventual victims that would be assimilated into the Empire, it was also where the largest clans of Minotaur had lived. When the Noxians began their invasion, the Minotaur clans began to ally themselves with the Noxians in hopes for their survival. The clans who rejected the alliances, however, such as a warrior clan with a Minotaur fighter named Alistar, would be branded as rebels. Eventually, they were captured and sent to the Reckoner arenas. All of these warriors died in the arena, except for Alistar. The continuing conquests of the south brought many more settlements to the Empire, including the coastal settlement of Basilisk. 3 noteworthy orphans from Basilisk in particular, named Darius, Draven, and Quilletta Varn, would eventually join the Noxian army after their captors deemed them strong enough to serve. It should be emphasized that the true purpose of the Reckoner Arena wasn't just to entertain the Noxian nobility, no. The true purpose of the arena was to see and determine which warrior was the strongest. Whoever or whichever one of them survived, it did not matter what their background was, or what race they were, what creature they were, or which settlement or nation they were from. The Noxians look for strength above all. Those who have survived would be given either their freedom or the freedom to serve under the Noxian army. This, however, did not mean that the Noxian nobility, even the Black Rose, were inactive in most of their conquests despite the vast amounts of entertainment. As a matter of fact, the nobility within the Empire would be shaken. In turn, would shake the Noxian higher class to the point of instability.
The battlefield is a game won with cunning and control. Like the fox, we watch, listen. And like the wolf, we strike at first opportunity.